Malachi chapter 2 and verse 16. We're going to continue our discussion on marriage, divorce, and remarriage this morning. And we're going to be getting into some of Jesus' teachings in Matthew chapter 19 and Matthew 5, 31 and 32 this morning. But first I wanted to take a quick little pit stop at this passage, Malachi 2:16. Now, the scripture says, "For I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel, and him who covers his garment with wrong, says Lord of hosts. So take heed to your spirit, that you do not deal treacherously." Malachi 2:16. Now, if you look back at verse 15, I should have read that one too. He says, "But not one has done so. Who has a remnant of the Spirit? And what did that one do while he was seeking a godly offspring? Take heed then to your spirit. Let no one deal treacherously against the wife of your youth. For I hate divorce," he says in verse 16. Says the Lord God of Israel, "and him who covers his garment with wrong, says the Lord of hosts. So take heed to your spirit, that you do not deal treacherously." When we read in Malachi 2:16, when he says, "I hate divorce," specifically what he's talking about, as you see in the previous verse in verse 15 and in the end of verse 16, is treacherous divorce. A divorce that was not in line with the law. What I mean by that is, in Deuteronomy 24, a divorce certificate was given to protect the woman. And so, while obviously it was not in God's original plan, for people to divorce, he meant marriage to be a lifelong institute. He would not be hateful towards the woman who sought a divorce in a situation where her husband was cheating on her or whatever it might be. The divorce that he hates, as you see here in the context, is treacherous divorce. Treacherous divorce, where it comes out of a hard heart, where the man is simply casting the woman aside, or vice versa. A situation in which a great unfairness is being done. This would include even divorcing a woman without giving her a certificate of divorce, which would not allow her to remarry, and which would put her in an awful situation if she had no one to go to for financial support in this culture. So this passage is brought up a lot when people talk about divorce, and some people use this passage to say that no divorce at all is allowed by Scripture. They don't believe for fornication, for anything. No divorce is allowed at all. And so this is a passage that they often use. But if you look at the context of verse 15 at the end of verse 16, he's talking about dealing treacherously with someone, not going through the proper means allowed by the law to separate. What's your thoughts on that?
My thought on that is that I agree with your first part of the statement.
Right.
In God's mind, there was no reason, no acceptable reason. When he established marriage, there was no thought of divorce.
Right.
And we read in Deuteronomy, we find out that Moses sought that from God. He went to God for that, and he did it because of the treachery of men, a hardness of men hard against their wives.
Right.
And so to save the women, or to somewhat provide for the women, that was permitted, but that was not God's intent from the very beginning. There was no. In other words, when he formulated the idea of marriage, there was no idea of putting away a wife.
Right.
Putting away a husband. It's supposed to be a lifelong commitment, as you said, and that was God's plan.
Right. And same with
men become so evil and so treacherous towards their wives, or and these days, wives being so treacherous against the husband.
Right. He
allowed Moses to incorporate that into the law, but it was not his design at the beginning.
Right, and this is true about everything. God did not design, or not. God did not. His will was not for Adam and Eve to leave the garden. Mm-hmm. He obviously wanted them to stay in there with him the whole time. Because of their sin, though, he put things in place to allow an avenue of fellowship, with them, and ultimately, the plan was for Christ to come and die for them. And then you have other situations. God's plan for us is to walk in the light as he is in the light. But if we step out of the light, we have opportunity to come back. And the same thing was with marriage. God's plan is for it to be one man and one woman for life, not for any sort of temporary time. But since God knows how man acts, and how men could deal treacherously with their wives, or maybe how a wife could deal treacherously with a man from hard-heartedness, then he put a system in place to allow the innocent party to escape the evils of the other individual. And so that's what we're going to see a little bit this morning. But I want to bring that passage up to show that, that this passage is not saying that God does not allow any divorce. This passage is saying that, one, we know that God wanted marriage to be for life, but also that God hates treacherous divorce, where individuals are being taken advantage of and done wrong and out of the hardness of the man's heart. Okay, before we get into the passages in Matthew, we need to do a little bit of necessary review here, just for the sake of getting everybody caught up on the same page. So in the Old Testament, there are 3 reasons for divorce. There's actually, it could be 4. You could consider incestuous marriage in those reasons, but we don't have as much evidence of that. A lot of it comes from, and there's a debate about whether or not they were ever even married to begin with. So we're not going to get into that reason, but in normal marriages, there's 3 reasons for divorce. Who can name those, or one of those? All right, so we have fornication. That's in Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. And in that passage, it doesn't specifically say fornication necessarily. That's why there's a debate about it. But we'll put fornication because that's what we know from the New Testament. All right, what's another reason for divorce under the Old Testament? Yeah, that kind of goes into what. Yeah, that's what Deuteronomy 24 says. Found some sort of uncleanliness, but there was a debate whether or not you interpret that as fornication or as any cause or any reason. So that's y'all got both sides of that. Good. There's 2 other reasons though. One comes from Exodus 21. The other comes from Ezra 9 and 10.
Ezra 9 and 10 is that they were married outside of their tribe, outside of the nation of Israel.
Yeah, so they're marrying unbelievers, individuals outside of the nation of Israel. And specifically, they were marrying individuals outside of the land of Israel who were causing them to sin. There are multiple cases in the Old Testament of a Jewish being a Gentile wife that produced a lot of good and was blessed, namely Ruth and Boaz, right? Because who came from Ruth and Boaz? Yeah, Jesus, of course. So there's situations in which, this was not a thing that you had to do, but in Ezra 9 and 10, all the people do this, and they do it according to the law of the Lord, is what the text says there, because the Gentile women are causing them to sin, and they just got back into the land. Johnny, were you going to say something? All right, we have one more reason for divorce in the Old Testament.
She was not a virgin.
Right. So that is actually, yeah, that's right. If she, if they lied and said that she wasn't a virgin, then the marriage contract was annulled because there didn't seem to be any, they were married on faulty grounds to begin with. It's kind of like incestuous marriage. They did not even consider that a marriage because there was a lie. They lied about it. So that's a reason for sure. There's one more that has that it's in regards to a perfectly healthy marriage to begin with. You might know what that one is. It's from Exodus 21, verse 10, I believe, 9 and 10. That's if the man married a second wife, and because of that he paid special attention to her and did not. Yes, here we go. Yeah, verse 10 and 11. If he takes himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he will not do these 3 things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. So there was a situation as well where if he didn't take care of her, if he did not provide her those 3 things, Exodus 21, 10, and 11, then she could go out without price. That is, she could go out without having to pay what's called the bride price to the husband, whereas she would have to in another situation. All right, so those are the three major reasons that we have for divorce and a marriage that otherwise begin relatively healthy. All right, unlike if she wasn't a virgin, and also unlike if it was incestuous relationship, those marriages were never seen as even taking place to begin with. Okay, so the reason why I bring this up is because of Matthew chapter 5. Let's go there. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17 and 18, or really 17 through 20. Matthew 5, 17 through 20. He says, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." And we can stop there if you'd like. But the point is that Jesus is even saying this about himself. If he was to change one word of the law before it's all fulfilled, then he would be called least in the kingdom of heaven. If he was to add to or take away from the law in any way, that was going against his stated purpose of what he was doing on earth in Matthew 5, 17 through 19. This means that when we interpret Jesus' words about marriage, divorce, and remarriage in Matthew 5, 31 and 32, and in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 9, if our conclusion contradicts what the law says, then we are going right against what Jesus said he was going to do in Matthew 5, 17 through 19. In other words, Jesus' teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage cannot contradict what we've learned from the law. Here's another reason for that. Let's go to Matthew 19 for just a moment and look at verse 3. Matthew chapter 19 and verse 3. Notice what the Pharisees asked him. This is extraordinarily important. Some Pharisees came to Jesus testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" Key word, lawful. In other words, is it in line with the law of Moses? Does the law of Moses teach that we can divorce our wives for any reason at all? And this means that Jesus' answer that he's going to give in the following passages comes from the law of Moses. That's a big deal, okay? And so what we've done, as I mentioned before, is we teach the exact opposite thing that Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 teaches. In times past we've done that. Because Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 says that if a man finds some unpleasantness in his wife, and he gives her a bill of divorcement, and she goes out and she marries another, she's not allowed to return to the original husband. She can't go back to the original husband. We've taught the exact opposite of that. We've taught if she's given a bill of divorcement, not only can she not marry anybody else, but the only person that she can return back to, the only person that she can't ever marry again is the original husband, and that's exact opposite of what Deuteronomy 24 says. Which means we've got Jesus directly contradicting the law when that's the one thing he said that it was definitely not going to do in Matthew 5, 17 through 19. He says he's not going to take away one jot or tittle. He's not going to add to it one bit, because if you do that at all, you're going to be taken out of the kingdom of heaven. You're not going to be allowed into the kingdom of heaven. And so when we read Matthew 19 and Matthew 5, we have to keep in mind that it's not going to contradict Deuteronomy 24, 1-4, Exodus 21, 10 and 11, or Ezra 9 and 10, or these other passages in the Old Testament that talk about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. All right. That being said, I want to point out a difference between the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark. Let's go, I believe it's Mark chapter 10, if you want to go ahead and head that way. I just got to get it out of my notes here real quick. Mark chapter 10 and verse 11. Notice what Mark chapter 10 and verse 11 and 12 say. Now, pretend like the only Bible you have, does not have Matthew in it, and you just have the Gospel of Mark, okay? And you read this passage. Whoever divorces, he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. Is there any what's the exception in verses 11 and 12? There is no exception in verses 11 and 12, right? If you were just to read this passage, you would just think that Jesus is not allowing any divorce for any reason whatsoever, and anybody that divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, no matter the cause. If you just read Mark chapter 10, 11, and 12. However, let me show you something about the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark and how they work together. Go back in the book of Matthew for a moment to Matthew chapter 12. Go back for a moment to Matthew, chapter 12. In Matthew chapter 12, we have this statement that's made in verse 38 and 39. We read, some of the scribes and Pharisees said to him, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." But he answered and said to them, "An evil and adulterous generation craves for a sign, yet no sign will be given to it but the sign of the prophet Jonah." All right, you see there? No sign will be given to it but the sign of the prophet Jonah. There's an exception offered in Matthew chapter 12. Look at Mark's account, though. In Mark chapter 8 and verse 11 and 12. Notice the difference between Matthew 12 and Mark 8, 11, and 12. The Pharisees came out and began to argue with him, seeking from a sign from heaven to test him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, "Why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." Okay? So, in Matthew, we have a statement about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, except it be for fornication. In Matthew, we have a statement made about about whether or not a sign would be given. He says no sign will be given except for the sign of Jonah. In Mark, we have the opposite. In Mark, he says in chapter 10, marriage, if you divorce your wife, you've committed adultery against her, if you marry another. And then in Mark chapter 8, verse 11 and 12, he says no sign will be given, and he doesn't offer any exception clause there. The difference between the two Gospels is that Matthew is writing to a specific audience who has specific information in their mind about what Jesus did on his earth and what he taught and things like that, whereas Mark's audience has a different amount of understanding, or maybe Mark's audience has already read the book of Matthew or whatever it might be. And so if you look at the length of Matthew, 28 chapters, right? You look at the length of Mark, 16 chapters. Mark's is sort of a trimmed down version, abridged version. Mark doesn't have to say, except for the sign of Jonah, he was in the belly of the whale 3 days, 3 nights, this sort of thing, because his audience already knows that. He's given them the general story of the gospel without needing to get to the details, because his audience doesn't need all the details at that point. The book of Matthew, though, he gets into more information. Whenever Jesus says in Mark chapter 10, let's go back and look at that statement on marriage, divorce, and remarriage there. When Jesus says in Mark chapter 10 and verse 11, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery." He doesn't have to explain that there's these two positions. One position that says any reason at all, and another position that says only for fornication. He doesn't have to explain those reasons because his audience already knows them, right? He just says, whoever divorces his wife, and the implication there is treacherously divorces his wife. Because if he meant any divorce at all is committing adultery against the wife, then he would be contradicting several passages that we've already noticed in the Old Testament. Not only that, he'd be contradicting what he said in Matthew chapter 19 and Matthew 5. So we have to use some wisdom when we're looking at this passage. If we don't use wisdom when we look at this passage, we're going to be walking around with one eye and our hand cut off because we're going to look at every other passage absolutely literally divorced from its context as well, right? Because if your eye offends you, pluck it out, right? So we have to keep in mind Jesus' audience here. They already know what the debate is. They don't have to be filled in on it. And so we can insert the word treacherously before that and have it in line with Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 in the Old Testament. It's not supplied in Mark's gospel because it's not needed for his audience. Just like his audience doesn't have to know about the sign of Jonah. That's not what Mark is trying to accomplish with his gospel. He's writing to a different audience. He doesn't have to explain all the same things that Matthew has to explain. But that's all throughout Mark and Matthew. If you want to get, if you want, in all the gospels, if you want to tell me everything that Jesus said on the cross, then you can't just go to Matthew, or you can't just go to John, you can't just go to Mark or Luke. You have to look at every single gospel, take note of what Jesus said on the cross in each gospel account, and then you have a full picture of what Jesus said on the cross. Same thing is true with marriage, divorce, and remarriage. We have to go to all these passages to be able to get the full picture of what Jesus said. Let's look at Mark chapter 10 and verse 11, though, and pay special attention to the wording here. Pay special attention to the wording. Hey, by the way, Caden has 2 teeth on his bottom gum. And, yeah, it's been tough. I feel sorry for Laura, but every time I call her in the day, he's upset about that. But he's got 2 teeth on his bottom gum, and he bites hard. As you see here, a TV reset. But Mark chapter 10 and verses 11 and 12 says this. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman, notice the expression, commits adultery against her. Anybody's version read differently than that? Then commits adultery against her. Mark 10:11. Oh, there it was. Let me look it up in the King James here just to make sure. Because you're going to see a difference here in a second. Mark 10:11 says, committeth adultery against her. Whosoever shall put away his wife and marry another committeth adultery against her. Notice verse 12. If she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. Now, obviously, you could add on a little statement there, what was put in verse 11, against him, right? He is the victim, in other words. He's the innocent party. If she divorces his wife and she goes out and marries another, he's committing adultery against her. She is completely innocent in the matter. Now, obviously, she might have done something to make him mad or something like that made him want to divorce her. But regardless, that doesn't give him a right to divorce her treacherously if it's not for, the right reasons. And so, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. Okay, let's look at Matthew chapter 5 real quick and notice the difference in that passage and what we just read in Mark. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 32, the scripture says this. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity or fornication or whatever your version may say, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Do you see the difference between Mark chapter? Now this is in. If Jimmy, you've got the NIV, it's not going to be different in yours, I don't believe. But do you see how my version translates that? It makes her commit adultery. Well, how much sense does that make? It makes her commit adultery. She's there minding her own business, whatever it is, and he divorces her, and now he has this power over her because he calls her to commit adultery, according to my version. But look at this passage in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 32 in the NIV, for example. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Okay? But notice the difference here. The possibility of the translation makes her the victim of adultery. And that lines up more closely with what we read in Mark chapter 10 and 11 and 12. Is that if a man divorces his wife treacherously, he makes her the victim of adultery. Or as Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12 says, he commits adultery against her. In this situation, she's still the innocent party. He is doing something wrong to her to put her away in this way. He's making her the victim in this situation. But my version doesn't make that clear. But Mark 10, 11, and 12 does make it clear. Okay. I want to talk about this second statement, though. I wish I could pull these up side by side. I bet I can.
What's your version of 531 and
531. Whoever sends his wife away, let her give him a divorce certificate, or certificate of divorce. Matthew 5.
Yeah, Matthew 5, 31 and 32.
That's right. Whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery.
That's kind of what started all this, and I'm sure you remember that if she commits adultery, she's wrong, but if she didn't commit adultery, she's still wrong. You can't get remarried. That's what I'm reading. Is that not true or not?
Well, that's what we're about to get into here. Let me show you. So I'm going to pull it up here on both, that way that everybody can see it parallel. If you got a paper Bible, you can just flip back and forth. But I want you to notice, comparing these passages, notice what's happening here. Verse 32. Look at verse 32 of Matthew 5. It's on the left side of the screen. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. And we saw in the NIV and in Mark's account, it's better translated, commits adultery against her, makes her the victim of adultery. And he says, whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, Jimmy's dilemma is this. If a man is being abusive towards his wife, and he's just going to put her away, and he might be thinking to himself, I can divorce her, and as long as I'm the one doing divorcing and it's not for fornication, she can't remarry because that's her beliefs. And so I can really get her now. I can really put her in a tough situation now. So I'm going to divorce her to put her in this bad situation. Now she can't remarry. Now she's got to go her whole life, and her only option is to return to me. Wouldn't that just get her good? That's the way that a man could approach this verse. And that's Jimmy's dilemma with it. Now Deuteronomy 24 is there to protect that exact situation. Deuteronomy 24 is, you give her a certificate of divorce, and if she chooses to remarry somebody else, the last thing she can do is return to you, right? See the difference there. So if we interpret Jesus' words to say how we typically read this passage, we're causing him to contradict the very passage that he said he wasn't going to contradict. Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. If we also make Jesus' words say something that passage did not teach, we're actually making Jesus more harsh than what we learned in Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 and these other passages. We're making him be more binding where the law wasn't binding. Again, it's something that he said that he was not going to do. He said he wasn't going to add one thing or take away one thing until it was all fulfilled. He was interpreting this passage within the context of the law. Now, Jesus said in Matthew 11, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. But according to this, if we read it in the way that we have traditionally read it, we're making him place a much more difficult burden on the woman than what even the law did. The law was there to protect the woman, and it seems like Jesus would be taking away any protection. But let me show you this passage and compare it with 11 and 12 of Mark chapter 10, and we'll see where this passage makes sense. I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, we'll read it like the NIV says, makes her a victim of adultery. Okay? And then we read this passage. Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Look at 11 and 12 of Mark. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. Our assumption is that this woman here, at the end of verse 32, is the same woman as in the beginning of the passage. But that would cause it to contradict Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. What we see in Mark chapter 10 and 11 and 12, these verses are split up in such a way to show us that in this case it's the man who is doing the divorcing. He's the one that's leaving his wife. In this case, in verse 12, it's the woman who's leaving her husband treacherously. Now, the way that she would divorce her husband is to go and sue for a divorce certificate, to get the court to make her husband give her a divorce certificate so that she could leave. In other words, force his hand to make him divorce her in the court. The point is that in Matthew chapter 5:32, this second woman in verse 32 is not the same woman that's in the beginning of verse 32, just like it is here. This is not in this case, it's the man who's dealing treacherously with the woman. In this case, it's the woman who's dealing treacherously with the man. And the same thing's the case in verse 32. It's the man who's dealing treacherously with the woman, and it's the woman who's dealing treacherously with the man. See, it's not the same woman at the end of verse 32. That would make Jesus completely contradict what Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24 was there to protect the woman, not to hurt her, but to protect her, to give her an option to remarry, to give her an option to escape her treacherous spouse. But the way that we interpret this passage in verse 32 gives the man all the power and allows him just to take total advantage of her in a society in which she could barely prosper by herself unless she was a widow, right? And so the confusion in Matthew 5:32 comes in reading this as the same situation. Mark 10's version, though, in verses 11 and 12, shows us that two different situations are under consideration. In one case, it's the man dealing treacherously. He says if the man deals treacherously against the woman and goes and marries another, he commits adultery. He is committing adultery against her. And the same thing is true in verse 32. If a woman deals treacherously with a man, if she sues for that divorce certificate and gets it, and she goes out and marries another, then the man that's marrying her is committing adultery as well. He is complicit in that. He's a homewrecker, right? This woman here, let's see. The individual who he would go out and marry after her, she would be considered the homewrecker. She's just as wrong in this situation as he is. And the same thing is true here. The man that she goes out and marries after dealing treacherously with her husband is just as bad off as she is. They're both complicit in this act of treacherous divorce. In the first situation, the woman is the victim. He calls her to be a victim of adultery. In the second situation, this woman's original husband was the victim because she's dealt treacherously against her. And that's what you see in verse 12 of Mark chapter 10. If she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. She is committing adultery against her original husband. And he's free to remarry. He's free to remarry. He's the victim. He's innocent in the whole deal. If he's gives her that certificate of divorce, we learned in Deuteronomy 24, then she is free to remarry. The law is not going to be binding on her in that regard. Otherwise, the only option that she would have to survive is to return to her family if they would take her, if that's even an option for her, or to commit adultery by marrying someone, which would get her, put to death by the law, or she could always turn to prostitution. That's her options in that world. So the divorce certificate was given to protect the woman. They had turned it into a way to say, oh, we can just divorce our wife for any reason. As long as we give her a divorce certificate, she's not our problem anymore. That's how they had made it, but that's not what it was originally meant to be. It was originally intended as protection for the woman, and later on in time, when the woman gained more rights, it was included as protection for the man as well. Okay. Let's go to Matthew chapter 19. Let's go to Matthew 19. Let's take a little bit more look at this. We're going to look at that expression, except it be for fornication, next week. But let's keep talking about who's guilty in this passage. So, notice verse 7 of Matthew chapter 19. This is a really big insight into the Pharisees' thinking when they're having this discussion with Jesus. Matthew chapter 19 and verse 7. They said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Notice the word command there. Jesus said to them in verse 8, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you." You see the difference between command and allow. Okay, so they're handing out divorce certificates left and right as a way to just send the woman away whenever they want to. And the woman was free to go and remarry. As we saw in Deuteronomy 24, when she got this certificate of divorce, she was the victim. God came to set the captive free, not to put them into further captivity. He came to liberate. Jesus came to liberate people, not to put them into more bondage. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. And so under a system of grace, God is not going to suddenly do a 180 and start punishing the innocent party, one who's the victim of adultery, whose husband puts her away. And by the way, think back to Matthew 5. That man was committing adultery against her, and it doesn't even say that he went out and remarried just yet. He was doing her wrong, committing adultery against her, and just simply giving the divorce certificate treacherously to her. He was breaking the vows of his marriage, and that might lead to him going out and marrying another, but that's not what Matthew 5:32 said, that he committed adultery against her just by treacherously divorcing her. What you got, Zelda?
I was just going to ask a question because you said about the marriage and the divorce. Say the man went out and he committed adultery.
Yes.
Okay. Instead of him saying, "Okay, the wife says, okay, you did this here, and I choose not to be with you anymore. I want a divorce."
Right.
The man says, "Baby, I don't want a divorce. I did something wrong. I'm sorry. I apologize, and I asked for forgiveness, and I want to be forgiven."
Right.
The wife says, "No, I can't accept that."
Right.
If she goes ahead and get the divorce, what state she's in?
All right.
What state he's in?
So first off, she would not have been able to. That wouldn't have even been a thing, anyways, because she had no right. He in that world, he could be with as many women as he wanted to. He could marry whoever he wanted to. He could have multiple wives, multiple partners. That there was no polygamy was totally okay during that time. So that wouldn't have even been something that. Look at all Solomon's wives, right? That wouldn't have even been something that the courts would have thought was a big deal. Oh, he's got multiple partners, so what? He's the man. Only she's not allowed to have multiple partners in that culture. Now, Jesus obviously shows, he reveals the problem with that in his time. But let's get back to your situation, though. If she asks for divorce, if she goes and sues for divorce at the court to get him to give her a divorce certificate, and he says, no, I don't want to do that. And she says, well, I need to do that anyways. That's totally within her rights in Scripture. He has broken the marriage covenant. The vows that he made to her, he's shattered. And if he asks for forgiveness, she can forgive him without staying with him. She can say, hey, I forgive you. I understand that's what you did, but I can't be with you. We have this idea that forgiving somebody means that you have to totally be okay with whatever they do, like if somebody punches you in the face and they say, I'm sorry about that, please forgive me. And, you can forgive them and still kind of keep your guard up, like, you know what I mean? You be cautious around them. And so if a man cheats on his wife and she wants to divorce him and he says, oh, please forgive me. That could be him taking advantage of Jesus' words, if he repents, forgive him. He could be taking advantage of that and saying, she forgives me. She has to forget, which means that she has to stay with me anyways. So let me just go do whatever I want to do, and as long as I ask forgiveness, everything's A-okay. So that's not a healthy marriage anyways. But anyways, should be free to divorce. Should be free to divorce, even if he asks forgiveness, and she can give him the forgiveness and still divorce her husband. And if she wanted to remarry, that'd be perfectly okay, because the divorce certificate dissolves the marriage. And as you see in Well, in their world anyways, he would be free to marry multiple wives anyways, so what's that, what big of a deal is that? But the divorce certificate dissolves the marriage. He would have to reevaluate, he's obviously sinned and done something wrong in the sight of God, but he would be free to remarry as well, as you see in Deuteronomy 24. Let's go back there, and I want to show you that real quick. Let's not read this passage as some indecency. Let's read this passage as fornication, because that's something that's indecent. So let's put that word fornication in there for a moment. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some fornication, he's committed fornication against him, and he writes her certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house, and she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. Okay, let's just stop there. Notice he does not go on to say she is in sin for doing that, for going out and marrying somebody else. Nope. As long as she has that certificate of divorce, she's free to go out and become another man's wife in verse 2. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the point of the certificate of divorce anyways. Okay? Because if she didn't have that, they would say she was committing adultery. Because remember, she can have only one husband. He can have as many wives as he wants to in this culture. Okay, so Deuteronomy 24, 1 to 2. So let's swap the genders here. Let's pretend like this is 21st century standards. No polygamy, none of that involved. Both are each accountable, for their actions in that regard. All right. Let's see. It happens that he finds no favor in her eyes because she has found that he's committed fornication against her, and she writes him a divorce certificate and puts it in his hand and sends him out of her house, and he leaves her household and goes and becomes another woman's husband. See, same thing as could be said. The guilty party can remarry because the divorce was a clean cut. She can't be bound to him, and at the same, she can't be loose from him, and at the same time, him be still bound to her. If their certificate of divorce is given, then the woman is free to remarry, and that's for her protection, and the man is free to remarry, and that's because the divorce is clean. There's a clean cut where that certificate of divorce is given. And
does it? Let me ask you a question.
Go for it.
Does it? The divorce, the write a note of divorcement and place it in his hand, in her hand or his hand.
Right.
Does that note has to spell out what the indecency was?
It depends on if you're talking to a judge at the court of, I think it's Hillel and Shammai. That's the debate that's going on in Matthew 19. One of the courts would put, it's literally any cause would be the expression. The other court would put for fornication. So like whenever Joseph is going to send Mary out in secret, he would have used a divorce certificate that said any cause. That, in other words, to hide the reason why he was putting her away. So it depends on the court that you talk to. Now keep in mind, Zelda, the question that we just answered has nothing, at this point, it's not about today. Because Jesus isn't concerned with new law in Matthew 19. Jesus is interpreting the law of Moses. So what I just said doesn't necessarily apply today yet. We haven't got that far in our class yet. See, that's the problem with people talking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, is that they jump into Matthew 19, 8, and 9, thinking that Jesus is giving new law, but Jesus is interpreting the law that Moses gave. Okay? Jesus isn't giving new law yet. Now, that doesn't mean it's not applicable to us, but we're going to talk about that when we get to Paul in 1 Corinthians 7. As of right now, though, that's the big revelation, is that Jesus isn't giving new law, he's interpreting old law. I've always treated this as Jesus giving new law, but it's not. He's interpreting the law of Moses. Okay, let's see. That's 10:25. Okay. That's a good stopping place, I suppose. Next week, what we're going to do is we're going to look at that exception, except for immorality or except for fornication, right? In Matthew 5 and Matthew 19:9. And we're going to talk about what that means. And then once we get into that, we will go and hopefully get into Paul next week is the idea. All right? Okay. We'll stop there for